Good evening, everyone. I am Dolores Donnelly, Community Development Officer within Armagh City, Banbridge and Craigavon Borough Council. I've organised this lecture series on behalf of Council, and this project has been fortunately part financed by the Executive Office of Northern Ireland. Welcome to week 2 of our lecture series, which has proven a great success so far. I would like to say that our recording will be on YouTube by early next week. And just that the guest speakers tonight will be Dr. Gerard MacAtasney, who will speak on the workhouse, creation of the workhouse system during the famine, with case study on Lurgan Workhouse, County Armagh. Gerard's books include The Dead Buried by the Dying, The Great Famine in Leitrim. Another is The Other Famine, 1982 Crisis in County Leitrim. And also another piece of work was his book on Leitrim and the Croppies. He's also contributed to the Atlas of the Great Famine and was co-author of The Hidden Famine, Poverty, Hunger and Sectarianism in Belfast. Gerard, would you like to start, please?
Thank you very much, Dolores. Last week we listened to Dr. Anya Dorn speaking about the 1833-1836 Poor Commission inquiry as a preamble to sort of studying the famine. And tonight, I want to look at what was in place prior to the building of the workhouses. And the workhouses, for many people, are seen as the epitome of the Great Hunger. Dark, foreboding, huge places, hated by the people who had to go into them, and still standing in many cases to this day. Camouflaged to a large extent by new buildings, for example, Lurgan and Lisburn. But if you look closely, you can still see that they are essentially the same buildings as were constructed in the late 1830s, early 1840s. So prior to the poor law being established in Ireland in 1838, there existed a system of parochial poor relief. This was designed around the local Church of Ireland through their cess and through their tithes. And they catered for the local poor, and it varied from place to place. There was no standardization. So in some places there would have been a census taken of the number of the poor, so they could work out how much was required. In other places it was done on an ad hoc basis. This developed throughout the 19th century, and you find then that in some other areas the poor were badged to stop outsiders coming through. And this was one of the great fears, that with the increasing population, more and more, especially if an area was quite generous or seen as being generous, more and more poor would arrive from different areas looking to avail of the relief that was there. And having studied this, I actually wrote a paper for Seamus Ardwaha around about 2008, I think it was, on basically how the poor were catered for in County Armagh. And it was entitled Mendicity and Charity in pre-famine County Armagh, but somebody's spell check went wrong, so it's actually in the book, or in the Seamus, under the title of Mendacity and Poverty in County Armagh. So if you want to read about lies in County Armagh pre-famine, that's the article about. But throughout that period, the population is increasing dramatically. The number of poor is increasing, and the Whately Commission, as it was called, from 1833 to 1836, estimated that about 2.8 million people were in severe distress for about 30 weeks of the year. So more than a third of the population in severe distress, in a land that was rich in so many ways in terms of natural resources. And of course, that's a question that has to be answered as well. Why did that happen? But one of the aspects that I found fascinating was the provision for the foundlings. Foundlings were children who were abandoned. And actually, if you look at what are called the outrage papers, say 1820s, 1830s, pre-famine, you find a significant number of cases of infanticide where children were killed by their parents, either due to the fact that they were born out of wedlock, or the family was just too poor and couldn't afford another child, so they were found in rivers, lakes, etc., down wells. But the foundlings then were catered for by the Church of Ireland with a cess. There was a tax that was passed over the parish. In the late 18th century, the Dublin Foundling Hospital was established, and this round about, it was the 1790s. And what you find then, looking through the vestry minutes from parishes throughout Ireland, is that the Church of Ireland are now sent foundlings to the Foundling Hospital. Thousands ended up there. They actually had a device whereby, for anonymity, a mother could, and it was always the mother who was left to cope with the child. The mother would put the baby into on the outside, on the door, in a basket outside, and the door would then revolve, and the child would end up in the foundling hospital, and the mother could just have lost the child. In fact, the foundling hospital was established in England in the 1740s. And to this day, you can still see the tokens that were left with the children by the mothers, with their initials carved in, the date they were left in, etc. They were in huge glass cases, very hard to look at because the mothers never saw their children again. The death rate in the foundling hospital in Dublin was in and around 90%. And I remember looking at that, the double, triple check that, but it was actually 90%. They were also, children were sent out to the country to nurse. So it was a last resort for the parishes to send them to there. But what you found then, that pre-famine, the population increasing dramatically, you had voluntary relief through the vestries. You also had initiatives in different towns. So, for example, in Newry, you had what was called the Newry Workhouse and Mendicity, which was a small workhouse which catered for people who had nowhere to live, and also then provided work for the people during the day and food. And crucially, they got food outside the workhouse and also at their homes. And these were two provisions which were banned under the Poor Law Act, which was established in 1838. And in Lurgan was quite a strange town compared to others. There was George Greer talked about it being a philanthropic society, was the distributed food to the poor. But Lurgan didn't have anything like Newry, and even in such a thriving industrial town, Newry had two newspapers: Newry Telegraph, Newry Examiner. Armagh had the Ulster Gazette. Lurgan had no newspaper until 1849, only lasted a year or so, and then it was only until the 1870s that there was a regular newspaper in Lurgan. So Lurgan sort of stands out as slightly different. Can't put my finger on why. And we mentioned Lurgan obviously because the Lurgan Workhouse is the case study. So the workhouses then are established in under the Poor Law Act of 1838, and this was very much a case of an English law being imposed on Ireland. Now, there were arguments for and against the Poor Law. Those who contributed in a charitable aspect, they supported the Poor Law because they said, right now, people are going to have to pay the tax which comes with the Poor Law, and it was a tax on the land to support the poor. Others objected to it, and they did find then that initiatives like the Newry Workhouse Mendicity declined. The Belfast Charitable Society, which celebrates its 250th anniversary in a couple of years, they were morbid about the whole idea of a poor law because they thought they would lose their institution. And one of the things that stands out with the poor law, one of the main objections to it, was, apart from the fact that it was antithetical to the Irish nature, was this idea of external interference. And you find this all the time, that those who ran the workhouses despised being told by the central commissioners what to do. So they're established in 1838 under the Poor Law, and they start emerging in the country 1840, 1841. By the time of the Great Hunger, 1845, one of the last ones opens, that's Glenties in County Donegal. There are 130 Poor Law workhouses in Ireland, and the Poor Law Union was the basis for the population for each workhouse. So it was roughly, the workhouse would have been centred in an area that had a 10-mile radius. So Lurgan, for example, included as far west in County Armagh as Tartarahan, over into northwest Down, Mara, and then up into southwest Antrim, up as far as Ballinderry. So it was 10 miles there. The further west you went, the larger the area got. So, for example, in Ballina, the area could be 25, 30 miles in circumference. And people then had to travel that distance if they wanted to seek relief. And there are tales of one woman who walked 25 miles in the snow in the winter of 1847 to seek relief for herself and her child, and she was deemed to be ineligible and had to walk back the 25. Whether she made it or not is another question. So there is a prelude to the foreboding workhouses being established in 1841, and that was the parochial poor law. That then declined, poor relief, that declined, and then you've got the workhouses coming into being from roughly 1841 onwards. Who did they cater for? Well, and what was the attitude of the administrators of the Poor Law? Well, George Nichols, who had established the workhouses in England under the 1834 Poor Law Act, he then became the Commissioner for Ireland. And he said, "I wish to see the poor house looked to with dread by our labouring classes. and the reproach for being an inmate of it extend downwards from father to son. Let the poor see and feel that their parish, although it will not allow them to perish through absolute want, is yet the hardest taskmaster, the closest paymaster, and the most harsh and unkind friend they can apply to. So not a place that you're going to enter lightly. And given, the construction of them, huge buildings, the Lurgan one was designed to hold 800. It was usually workhouses were designed to hold between 400 and 1,000. So Cork would have been 1,000, Belfast 1,000, Dublin North, South 1,000 each. The major cities would have had larger workhouses. And the poor commissioners commented as follows about the style of the building. The style of buildings is tended the cheapest description compatible with durability and simplicity of arrangement. All mere decoration being studiously excluded. So 22nd of February 1841, Lurgan Workhouse opened, and it receives its first inmates, 43 in total. And this is just a collection, a snapshot of those who were applying. This is typical. Sarah McCorry, 34, spinner, widow, Catholic, Lurgan town, admitted with one child, both in fever, came to workhouse in a cart, dirty, filthy, ragged, and miserable. John Lavery, 73, labourer, badly in fever, poor and naked. Had a wife and 5 children outside, but they were very poor and not able to keep them. Sarah Arnold, 84, widow, Catholic, Warrenstown, infection of lungs, wretched and filthy look, came in a cart. William, Mary and Elizabeth Dines, 10, 7 and 5 respectively, Protestant, motherless and deserted by father, starved and nearly naked. William King, 60, flax dresser, Protestant, Lurgan town, rheumatic, came in a wheelbarrow, very wretched and dirty. So that is typical of what was entering the workhouse at that time. The most unfortunate, the old, the infirm, orphans, deserted children, mothers with young children. Bolstering the findings of the Poor Inquiry of 1836, there existed a body of people living in extreme poverty and destitution in this area. And then thirdly, a clue to the extent of reliance on the linen industry is given by the bulk of the population, referenced as to spinners and flax dressers. Out of a total of 652 entrants to the workhouse in 1844, 172, or over 1/4, were listed as making their living from one branch or other of the linen industry. Allowing for the old and infirm, this would appear to support the idea that even with a strong linen base, many within this industry were surviving at this lowest subsistence level prior to the famine. I dealt with that last week, where I talked about the deindustrialization, especially in the west of Armagh, where the land had been subdivided to a great extent, so that 1/4 acre plots were standard because people had the weaving to rely on. Once that collapsed in the 1830s with the mechanization of spinning, then they faced as many problems as those in counties like Galway and Mayo. Now, throughout the years 1841 to 5, the workhouse served its purpose, catering for the destitute without any great difficulty, and numbers never rose above 55% of the capacity of the building. And having looked at most of the workhouses in Ulster as well, we find that this to be the case. You might get the odd fever outbreak, as we'll see here, but generally, the poor did not want to go to the workhouse. For some, maybe it was a way of seeing off an old relative, getting them into the workhouse, getting them away because they were too difficult to look after. And in fact, when you look at the workhouse, it's the early stages of the hospitals, obviously, and also dispensaries, which would have been the early stages of the GP service. They emerged from about 1812 onwards. So that by 1821-22, you have a fairly a good provision for dispensaries throughout Ulster. And then the workhouses are supposed to supplement this. But very rarely did they get about anywhere near their capacity. For example, 1842, the first full year in Lurgan, the average in the workhouse was 297. It was built to accommodate 800. Following year, 1843 is 258, 1844, 295, and 1845 then 222. However, in that year, May 1845, the first break in the previously sound administration occurred when, after allegations of poor management and levity of conduct were made against the master and matron, both resigned their position. The following month saw the appointment of 2 workhouse masters, Archibald Temple, who resigned after 4 months, and Charles Rooney, who started on the 22nd of October 45 and only stayed until the 4th of April 46. Such changes can hardly prove conducive to effective management, and indeed the first evidence of inefficiency and carelessness was manifested in the doctor's report of October 45, when he suggested that diarrhea and other connected problems among the young children were as a direct consequence of them being forced to sit in the nursery and schoolroom in cold and dank conditions. Further to this, in February 1846, a visiting committee from the Poor Law Commissioners described the house as being, quote, in a very filthy and unclean state. And the Guardians actually, I forgot to mention this, but the Guardians were, ostensibly there was an election of Guardians to run the Poor Law Union, usually in and around 30 men. Obviously, it was men all the time, no women played a leading role at this stage. And apart from some areas where it was politicized, and it was the first time, and it's always worth bearing in mind when we look at this period, the 1840s, that it's only less than 20 years prior, Catholic emancipation, 1829. So the first Catholic churches are only being built in many areas post 1829. So the Guardians then, they were elected in some areas, but mostly there was no election took place. And you would have found there would be competition between local landlords to get their agent a top place amongst the Guardians, because then they could influence the way the Poor Law was managed throughout the Union. And that was what was called by a Poor Law Union. So the street in Lurgan, where the workhouse was, the hospital now is, it's called Union Street. Nothing to do with the active union, but actually it was the Poor Law Union Workhouse. So in 1846, the visiting committee said it was in a very filthy and unclean state. And the Guardians ordered the house to be cleansed and washed every day, with any pauper who refused to work forfeiting breakfast. Pauper was the term that was used to describe an inmate. And there's terminology of the time. So, for example, one of the wards was described as an idiot ward, and that was for people who were had mental health problems, as we say today, and also epileptics, but they were just described as idiots. Now, the first failure of the potato crop in August, and I mentioned this last week, August 45 had a limited impact on the Lurgan. There's hardly any increase in the workhouse number. About a third, 25% of the crop failed. And the major consequence of that is the increase in prices. April 45 from 1 shilling 11 pence per hundredweight to March 46, 3 shillings 3 pence per hundredweight. Now, of course, in every situation, somebody's going to try to capitalize. Thomas Bullock, and a supplier of potatoes, attempted to exploit the situation by demanding 4 shillings a hundredweight. However, the Guardians rejected this, and they had to settle for 3 and 6. And just burned the previous year, there'd been 1 and 11. The natural corollary of these price rises was the gradual reduction of potatoes in the workhouse diet, being replaced at first by bread and then by meal. And when we talk about people who benefited from the famine, we talk about those who provided the workhouses, whether it be with clothing, with straw for the various houses that required, with bedding, and really with meal. And sometimes you find some of the work I've done, for example, in Manor Hamilton Workhouse in North Leitrim, that the Board of Guardians were given the contracts for meal to relatives. And nepotism, some things never change. And this is fairly, it's by no means uncommon, should say, at this period in various Poor Law unions. In April 46, dinner consisted of 7 ounces of meal made into stirabout. Stirabout was porridge. Meal was convenient because it was a cheap substitute, and in June, the Guardian circulated for tenders for supplies of the cheapest form available, yellow Indian meal. This, in spite of the fact that the Guardians, declared themselves averse to an exclusively oatmeal diet. There was a serious problem with Indian meal. Indian meal was rock hard, and it had to be boiled and boiled for hours and hours and hours before it became edible. And what you find that as the hunger moved on through 45, 46, and 47, people were so hungry, and as soon as they got the Indian meal, they ate it raw, and it killed them because it just destroyed their internal organs. The shortage of potatoes was also evident in the general union area. In Portadown, Board of Guardians objected to the workhouse being in Lurgan. It was always a competition between Portadown and Lurgan, and it was heightened by the fact that the leading Guardian of Portadown was William Blacker, a leading Orangeman who had fought at the Battle of Ballinammuck in 1798. He led the Seagull Yeomanry there. And he was opposed by Charles Brownlow's agent, John Hancock. John Hancock had married the daughter of one of the leaders of the 1798 Rising. He was a Quaker and very much anti-Orange Order and a liberal. So you can see that there'd been a clash there for a number of reasons. Portadown, Montepiety Society, Montepiety, had been established in 1838 as a loan fund in direct opposition to pawnbroker shops. However, it occasionally made money available for local charitable purposes, and in May 46 gave a grant of £50 towards the purchase of Indian meal for the poor of the area. So proof indeed that the crop failure 45, as the year goes on and we're moving towards what was hoped to be a successful crop of 46, it's having an impact. However, the poor were turning in greater numbers to the workhouse. And by June 46, there were almost 450 inmates in it, with a quarter of these being in the fever hospital. Now, given that in 1845 there were 222, with more than twice the number by June 46. This high proportion warranted a visit from Dr. Stevens, warranted a visit from Dr. Stevens, the fever commissioners. They're always looking in the poor law commissioners, the fever commissioners, the Board of Health, all based in Dublin, and they're always keeping an eye on every workhouse. There's a huge amount of correspondence between the various groups there and the clerk of the union. And I always remember that this external interference is despised. Now it has consequences. In his report, Stevens recommended that additional accommodation would be necessary in order to cope with increased numbers of fever patients. That's despite the fact that there was room for 800 in the workhouse. He's saying we need a larger workhouse fever hospital. However, the Guardians rejected this recommendation and stated that Dr. Bell turned out a great number of convalescents within these few days, and consequently has much more room than when Dr. Stevens was here. So Bell, the medical officer for the workhouse, his solution to the problem, too many fever patients being in the workhouse, was to kick them out. Stevens also reported that fever was much more widespread than it should have been because Dr. Bell was allowing non-infected children to enter the fever hospital with their sick parents. In light of this, the commissioners concluded, Dr. Bell is unfit for his present office, and we have therefore called an order to be prepared for his removal, which we shall issue without delay unless he tenders his resignation. This appeared to be a reasonable demand given Bell's apparent negligence. However, the Guardians received it with concern and surprise, and in offering a vigorous defence of the medical officer, they pronounced confidence in his skill, humanity, and great kindness apart. They don't want to mention the word ability, of course. In fact, they went so far as to blame the commissioners themselves for any problems which had arisen. The buildings, which had proved inadequate, had been constructed under guidelines set out by them, whilst they had refused to supply paid nurses when the doctor had asked. Probably taken aback somewhat, the commissioners acquiesced, and on reviewing the evidence, exonerated Dr. Bell from 2 of 4 charges made against him. The Guardians were delighted with the outcome, and shortly afterwards, they unanimously resolved to increase Bell's salary by £20 per annum. That would have to have been cleared by the Poor Law Commissioners. So this was really, telling the Poor Law Commissioners, keep your nose out. And not only are we backing them, but actually we're going to give them an increase. And a £20 increase was a hell of an increase at this stage. So they had successfully thwarted the attempt by the Poor Law Commissioners to exert their influence. But Bell had still been accused of turning out, and found guilty, according to the commissioners, of turning out convalescent patients and allowing children to enter with their infected parents. And this had severe consequences in the months that followed. And it's actually worth noticing that, or worth mentioning actually, that even things like sometimes the Board of Guardians would, at Easter, in some poor law unions, or at Christmas, they would allow the paupers, the inmates, a small piece of meat for an Easter or a Christmas dinner. We're not talking about T-bone steaks here. A tiny piece of meat to supplement their normal diet. And then within a week or so, there would have been a letter in from the Poor Law Commissioners, having read the Board of Guardians minutes, saying, you can stop that. That's not allowed. It's not within the Poor Law. Don't do it again. So you can see here why the Lurgan Board of Guardians were delighted, as they would have seen it to have got one over on the Poor Law Commission. Moving on to 1846, the crop is decimated, and the most notable manifestation of this is the increase in number. And this happens throughout Ireland. I've looked at Ulster, and it's every poor law union is the same. Whether it's ultra rich unions in the likes of the east of the province, like Newton Ards, or up in North Antrim and Ballymoney, Larne, Antrim, they all face the same problem. At the end of September 46, the number was 313. By October, 432. By November, 598. And by the end of December, the workhouse was full to capacity with 805 inmates. This increase in admission rates was accompanied by a corresponding rise in the number of deaths. Throughout the year, the average would have been about 14. But in November, 31 paupers died, and in December, there were 58 deaths. And then this continued, it accelerated in January 47. The first week of January, there were 18. Now, we're talking about weeks here, not months. The first week of January, there were 18 deaths. Second week, 36. Following week, 55. The pages of the visiting chaplain's notebooks, Church of Ireland, Catholic and Presbyterian, previously occupied with details of divine services and scripture readings, now told a sorry tale of multiple burials, with both the Catholic and Episcopalian chaplains performing interments on a daily basis. Concern was expressed by the commissioners in Dublin, and on 16th January they sent a letter to the Guardians indicating their regret at what they termed the great mortality in the workhouse and requiring a detailed report from Dr. Bale on the reasons for the high number of deaths. Perhaps mindful of the report of Dr. Stevens in May 46, they also asked for a report on the sanitary conditions in the building. And again, have a look at the workhouses, most of the workhouses in Ulster. This stands out. And when I started this work, it was just part of a master's degree. And what I wanted to do, it was around about the sesquicentenary of the Great Hunger. And I wanted to just look at the impact in my local area. And I remember being told actually by an academic that, I think it was when I was doing my DPhil, one of the questions was, why did you study County Armagh? And I said, well, it's my local area, and I wanted to assess, the impact of this historic event. And they said, that's not enough. You need to have a historic reason, almost like a historical scientific reason to study a particular area. I disagree with this. I think that, if you live in an area and you want to see the impact, then it's warranted to study it in detail using all the sources. In fact, one of the best pieces of work I've read on this would be by Charlie Dillon. I think the study was published in Shanna's Armagh as well. And Charlie's from the Moy area, which is on the Armagh-Tyrone border. And he does a really in-depth, detailed analysis of the impact of the famine in that area. Why? Because he's from that area and he wanted to see what had happened. So here we have then, the commissioners are startled. It's not happening. Maybe Enniskillen Workhouse is the only other one in the province where there's issues. So Bale, in his reply, states that many deaths had occurred because numerous people had entered the workhouse in a sick condition and had died shortly afterwards. Thus, mortality in the workhouse is much greater than under ordinary circumstances, and it is a well-known fact that many dying persons are sent for admission merely that coffins may be thereby obtained for them at the expense of the union. In relation to sanitation, he reported that as there were 4 times the usual number of inmates, the building was now overcrowded, and consequently it had been impossible to provide dry bedding. Hence, sleeping upon damp beds has increased fever and bowel complaints, which have in many cases proved fatal. However, the doctor concluded his report with optimism by arguing that the cause of such deaths would be largely eradicated with the purchase of new bedding and the creation of a proper drying house. Such a statement, whether to placate the commissioners or not, was soon shown to be rather utopian, as in subsequent weeks, mortality levels, far from falling, actually increased. In the weekend, the 23rd of January, 58 died. 30th of January, 68 deaths. 6th of February, 95 deaths. 13th of February, 67 deaths. And this may then be thought to be representative of what was happening throughout Ulster, but actually it wasn't. The weekend, the 6th of February, there were 95 deaths in the workhouse. This represented slightly less than 1/5 of the province's total mortality for that week, which was 529. Second highest was 30 deaths in Enniskillen. Nationally, the highest number was in Cork, where with a workhouse population of 5,500, which is 6 times that was in Lurgan, 128 deaths have occurred. In the province of Connaught, the highest level was in Lorrha Workhouse, County Galway, where with 524 inmates, 26 had died. The following week's total of 67 was second in Ulster behind that of Glenties, County Donegal, where 69 out of 426 had died. Once again, Cork was the highest with 164 deaths. Worth noting that Glenties was later to be deemed as one of the distressed districts by the British Relief Association, the only one in Ulster. As such, large-scale relief was required to staple up widespread poverty and hunger. At the same time, Cork has become synonymous with the horrors of famine and the existence of mass famine graves, Skibbereen. So in the months of 1847, the Lurgan area, described by a local paper as a prosperous and thriving town, was suffering a level of workhouse mortality on a par with the worst affected areas in the country. Dr. Bale's explanation that many deaths had occurred from sleeping on wet beds does not appear to have been entirely satisfactory, as members of staff, presumably enjoying better accommodation than the paupers, began to fall ill. By late January, the porter had dysentery, and the assistant wardmaster, together with the schoolmaster, were ill in fever. In February, the assistant wardmaster died, and the clerk was suffering from the high symptoms of dysentery. And it's worth pointing out that the majority of deaths throughout the country in this period weren't from starvation. Yes, there were cases of starvation, there's no two ways about it, but it was illnesses consequent upon stomach-related problems. So it was dysentery, it was chronic diarrhea, and of course fever as well, relapsing fever. So these were the main killers. And if you look at any of the statistics from the Prudhoe Commissioners from the 1846 onwards, you see that it's fever, it's dysentery, it's chronic diarrhea, and then there are cases of marasmus, of starvation, etc. But the vast majority were people were eating anything, and a lot of the food wasn't what they were used to eating, and the likes of the Indian cornmeal, they just couldn't deal with it. They didn't know how to cook it until well into maybe 1847. In a desperate attempt to alleviate what the Guardians called this dreadful visitation, two remedies were attempted. First, all available space was to be utilised in order to avoid overcrowding. Thus, the aged and infirm women were moved to a room above the stairs, and the women's day room was required for hospital purposes. And this is standard. Every workhouse in Ulster had extensions, temporary or permanent, and also in some cases huge tents were erected. Belfast, the workhouses where the city hospital is now in the Lisburn Road, and in Lurgan, opposite where the hospital is now, there were huge tents erected to deal with overcrowding. However, the Guardians felt that more drastic action was required. On the 5th of February, they issued the following announcement. Notice is hereby given that in consequence of the present state of the workhouse and fever hospital, the Guardians have been obliged to close their doors for the present against all further admissions. As a consequence, admissions were restricted to a trickle throughout this period from February to April, with authorities only allowing large numbers of applicants back in May. And that's what I was referring to last week. When the system collapsed, the administration couldn't deal with it. When you had the workhouse master, the matron, various ward masters, the clerks, all being seriously ill or dying, then you find that the standard books that were used to run the place, whether it be the admission registers or the Body Guardian minutes or whatever, they weren't filled in. So we don't have a precise figure, for example, of deaths in this period, certainly in workhouses, because they weren't recorded. The numbers weren't allowed in. So this puts huge pressure on the outside resources, the relief committees established throughout the country. As a second measure taken by the board was to request a visit by 3 eminent physicians in order to remedy the unprecedented extension of disease and death. The doctors, Thompson, Cumming and Purdon, recommended that a third medical officer, along with Doctors Bale and McVeigh, was essential to meet the current epidemic. They also conveyed the opinion that the present pauper's diet was inadequate, in that recently they had been receiving soup for dinner and 4 ounces of rice for supper instead of bread and buttermilk. The doctors considered such a diet to be insufficient to meet demand of paupers and recommended the following regime. So this was, again, diets were always being changed, whether it was to save money or, in this case, to try to improve the health of the paupers. Breakfast, 3.5 ounces of meal and porridge, 1/4 pint of buttermilk. Dinner, 6 ounces of bread, 1 pint of broth. Supper, 3 ounces of bread, 1/4 pint of buttermilk. They also stipulated that the porridge was to be made entirely of oatmeal, not Indian meal. The closure of the workhouse and visit of the doctor suggests the authorities and medical staff were having severe problems coping with the numbers of destitute persons now prevalent in the Lurgan Union. Indeed, in a communication to the Relief Commissioner's office in Dublin, John Hancock, one of the Guardians I mentioned, reported that of 313 cases on the books of the Lurgan dispensaries, this is very local, 136 were suffering from fever and dysentery. For the same period in 1846, that total had been 20. The extent of the epidemic may be gauged by Hancock's inquiry as to whether the Central Board of Health could appoint a medical officer to provide food and medicines for diseased, destitute people at their own houses. This was because the workhouse had been closed and he realised people needed help. But of course, this was turned down because you could not supply food or medicine to people in their houses, certainly not at this stage. Unfortunately, no reply to this letter exists, but it illustrates the extent to which fever and its associated ailments had become endemic in the Lurgan area and the level of helplessness felt by concerned gentlemen like Hancock. However, any belief that disease was rampant could not be blamed on the authorities, was challenged by 2 devastating and condemnatory investigations, one from within the workhouse, the other from without, which cast huge doubts over the incompetence of both the medical and administrative staff of that institution. And as at this stage, you look back to the report of June 1846, the upshot of which was the demand to dismiss the medical officer, which was turned down. The Newry Telegraph got wind of what was happening and talked about the frightful mortality in the workhouse, the fact that many of the office holders as well as the paupers had been ill or were presently ill. The Belfast Vindicator, meanwhile, informed its readers that nearly 400 paupers had died in the Lurgan Workhouse during the last 8 weeks. Commissioners had also been monitoring the situation, and obviously dissatisfied with the previous report of Dr. Bale, they decided to send Dr. Smith from the Central Board of Health to investigate workhouse conditions. Now, Smith visited 2 other workhouses in Ireland, Bantry and Cork, 300 miles to the south. He couldn't get much further south than Bantry. And in the winter of 1847, he then travelled north to Lurgan to investigate what was happening. So you can just imagine, you can just realise how bad the situation was that this man was asked to travel that far in those conditions to ascertain what was going on in the Lurgan Workhouse. So he completed his report on the 17th of February. And this concentrated on the standard of medical care in the workhouse, but as a consequence, it offered an insight into the competence of the general administration therein. The most striking feature of the institution that emerged was the level of overcrowding. Smith reported that in the male and female infirmaries, there was an average of 2 persons to each bed, although 3 and 4 per bed was not uncommon. And remember that these were people with fever. The wards themselves were found to be in a terrible condition. Quote, there are 4 wards in the idiot department that are without any flooring but the earth, and in 2 of them there are no bedsteads, so that the beds lie upon the wet ground. One of them, in which at the time of my visit 2 wretched creatures were dying, was in an exceedingly foul condition. In one corner a pile of old filthy clothes, shoes, etc. In another a large heap of straw. In another place a quantity of coal scattered about. The ventilation was very imperfect. Further investigation found the floors and the walls of the infirmary to be in a very discreditable condition, with the windows almost universally closed, the atmosphere close, the smell upon entering the rooms most offensive. Walls had not been whitewashed, buckets used as lavatories were allowed to sit for hours without being emptied, and medicines and drinks were served out on the floor where the boards were in a filthy state. A similar scenario was presented to the doctor in the fever wards. However, the fever hospital, controlled by a full-time nurse, was found to contain comfortable beds, clean walls and floors, well-ventilated wards, and well-attended patients. Due to general overcrowding, it emerged that, as a result of an inadequate supply of garments, the clothes of those paupers who had died of fever or dysentery was immediately used by other paupers without prior cleaning and drying. So paupers died, and the new intake received their clothes. Another area of concern was that of pauper burials. Evidently, many paupers had been buried less than 4 yards from the fever hospital, and in the centre of the burial ground was the well which supplied water to the workhouse. In fact, the graves had been dug so close to it that the water had become muddy and unfit for use. Not surprisingly, in the light of what had been witnessed, Smith described the Lurgan Workhouse as a picture of neglect and discomfort such as I have never seen in any other charitable institution. And I think that says a lot when people ask, was it typical? What was it like in the rest of Ulster? Well, here's a man coming from 2 workhouses in Cork describing it thus. He recommended the following measures be implemented as soon as possible. All admissions to the workhouse to cease until fever and dysentery cases abate, well, that already put into place. All rooms used by the sick to be properly fumigated and whitewashed. Movement of some patients from the infirmary to the workhouse where space was available. Thorough whitewashing of the infirmary, cleansing of its floors, improvement of its ventilation. And finally, daily inspection of the above recommendations be carried out by the medical officer. He specifically mentioned that. Excuse me. Alongside such improvements, Smith felt it necessary to apportion blame for the terrible conditions which he had encountered, and remarked, it's not difficult to deduce the causes of the mortality which has lately devastated the Lurgan Workhouse, and which still continues. He believed that the problem stemmed from the death of the master, John Mason, in early November 46, and the fact that 3 weeks passed before a successor was appointed. During this period, overcrowding had developed and continued till the end of January. This, coupled with the fact that many subordinate officers had been ill at one time or another, meant that ventilation, whitewashing, cleanliness appeared to have been neglected at the very time when the strictest attention to these important means of arresting the spread of disease were most imperatively called for. He contended that, despite a heavy workload, a little more activity on the part of Dr. Bell, together with a stricter surveillance by the guardians, would have prevented much of the mortality, stating, it appeared to me that the guardians had no knowledge of the state of the infirmary as regards cleanliness, ventilation, etc., either from personal observation or otherwise. The reports of the physicians informed them of its overcrowded state, and this was the only particular about it with which they seemed to have been acquainted. He concluded his report with the following indictment of the workhouse administration. I am of the opinion that the chief causes of the evil in question are internal and the result of defective management of the situation. In effect, follow on from the previous report. of June 1846. Only this time, hundreds of people had died as a consequence. Another report then emerged from outside. One of the chaplains, the Reverend Oulton, Church of Ireland chaplain for Lurgan, and he says he felt the need to draw his attention to the appalling standard of food being served in the workhouse. It is hardly to be wondered that so much disease should be in the workhouse if the description of food has for any length of time been such as I saw there today. He said that the bread used for supper was dark coloured, insufficiently baked and sour, whilst the broth was so bad that many paupers could not use it. He described the meat as being of the worst description that could be got in Lurgan Street, more like the flesh of an animal that had died of disease than being killed for food. Further, he doubted whether the cooking utensils and kitchen were in a hygienic condition. It was once in a very bad state and might be so again. Oulton concluded his letter thus: I could not refrain from mentioning these matters to you, which doubtless have had no inconsiderable share in producing the dreadful mortality which has swept our workhouse, and I am sure you will take the earliest opportunity of investigating them to the utmost. So there was an internal inquiry convened by the Board of Guardians involving the principal workhouse officers. The ward master, Thomas Lutton, said that the bread had been bad for over a week and believed it to be unfit for human food. He continued, many of the sick paupers have complained to me that the bread was so bad they could not eat it, and I consider their complaints were well founded. He said the beef used for soup was of a very poor quality and reported this to Mr. Bullock. He said it had a very offensive smell, but this soup was afterwards sent to the patients in the hospital. However, the stark contrast between the lives of the paupers and those of the workhouse officers is illustrated by Lutton's following revelation. The bread furnished to the officers cannot be complained of and is much superior to what is provided for the pauper. This point was corroborated by another ward master, William Furley, who stated the baker, when he brings bread, always has the officer's bread in a basket by itself. Furley also said the pauper's bread was unfit for human consumption, a view shared by Dr. Bell, who believed the bread had been of a poor quality for almost 2 months. Bell further remarked that the meat had been defective for a long time, though never as bad as now, and concluded, I have no hesitation in stating that the disease in the house would not have been as bad if we had had a sufficient supply of wholesome bread and good beef, such as was contracted for. Dr. McVeigh concurred with this opinion, believing that the diarrhea and dysentery now prevalent had been aided by the use of substandard bread. From my experience as a medical man, I don't know a worse description of food for persons affected with diarrhea, dysentery, than sour bread. The immediate consequence of the inquiry was the return of £200 of bread to the contractor. However, John Hancock, in a letter to the commissioners, reported that only £6 of meat had been deemed to be unsound. He also offered a possible explanation for the obvious chaos in the workhouse as being the fact that the master and matron both had fever, and thus their duties were being undertaken by the schoolmaster and mistress, who were doing their duty as well as can be expected under the present trends and circumstances. Now, the upshot was that Dr. Bell was forced to resign, arguably a year after he should have done in the first place. He was obviously, the workhouse was overwhelmed by the huge numbers, unprecedented numbers, as was every other workhouse. But the Lurgan Workhouse had previous, to use that term, and the signs were there. They were ominous signs prior to what happened from November, December 1846. I read out last week an account of the burial. So for those who didn't hear this, this was in the Lurgan Workhouse grounds. In the graveyard attached to the house, a large grave is made which fills nearly full of water a short time after it is opened. To its verge are brought the coffins containing the dead bodies. These coffins frequently contain 2 and 3 each. They are then put into the grave, in which they usually float. 1 or 2 persons then stand on the coffins in the water until the mould is heaped upon them. There are frequently 20 bodies in the one grave. So here we have mass burials in Lurgan. Now, it's just been I'm digressing slightly here, my privilege to have finished writing a history of Clan Gael Common Class Gael on Lurgan. It was their centenary last year. And the thing that stood out for me as a researcher was going through hundreds and hundreds of newspaper reports of games, looking at reports of AGMs, reading letters to newspapers, etc.
Sorry, George. Sorry, yes. Apologies. Just for our audience, can you explain Clan Gael, who they are, just briefly? Because
sorry, Clan Gael, Common Class Gael, GAA club in Lurgan. So camogie, Gaelic football for ladies and men. So it was their centenary. They were established in 1922. And the reason I mention that, I just spent I always keep thinking it's 4 years writing that book. And as a researcher, you always learn something when you're writing a book. And this one, what stands out for me is that amidst all the hundreds of newspaper reports that I mentioned, was the fact you were able to interview people who were involved, whether it be at the playing level, at the administrative level, or as supporters. And you're talking to people who are in their early 90s, most of them in their 70s and 80s, some in their early 90s, and their memories going back to the 1940s, and then remembering what their parents had told them maybe about the 1920s, 30s. And the point I'm making is that when you're looking at the newspaper reports, when you're looking at, in that situation, when you're looking at something like the Great Hunger, thousands of documents, workhouse registers, letters to the Poor Law Commissioners, letters to the Relief Committee in Dublin, the Relief Committees writing the Irish Relief Association papers, the Society of Friends, huge archive. When you're looking through the newspapers, you're scratching the surface. You're only scratching the surface. And I suppose the nearest thing we have to, I just read out an account of people being buried in the workhouse grounds. Who were they? And it's very easy to say, oh, during the famine, 1841, 1851, population of around about 8 million, 8.5 million, 1 million died and 1 million emigrated. It just flows off the top. And the reality is borne out in the poorhouse admission register. Here we have the names, occupation, religion, gender, the area that they came from. And there were 130 poor law unions I mentioned last week. There are only 17 unions for which these registers exist, and not in their entirety for all of them. 12 of these are in Ulster, 2 in Armagh, Lurgan and Armagh poor law unions. I'm going to read out now, and this is just purely random. This is 24 names of people who entered the Lurgan Workhouse in December, on the 17th of December, 1846. They all died. 22 out of the 24 entered the workhouse in a healthy state. So I'm just going to read them as follows. So it'll be the name, the age, occupation, religion, and also the area. Catherine Green, 40, and her son Robert, 3. She was a labourer, Protestant, from Tullylish. Margaret Quayle, 27, single, a labourer, healthy, from Derryad. Anne Morris, 17, single, a weaver, Protestant, from Kernan. Dennis Brown, 6, deserted, Protestant, union at large. Union at large meant that they couldn't find out where they were from, and particularly in the union, so it could have come from anywhere. He'd been deserted by his parents if they were still alive, or else they had died and he had nowhere else to go. Margaret Kennedy, 81, single, a spinner, Catholic, infirm, from Ballydugan. James Neal, 74, married, labourer, Catholic, from Ahagallen. Elizabeth Carson entered with her 5 children. She was 43. The children were Ellen, 14, and David, 12. They both survived until June and July 1847 and then left the workhouse. But Ellen, 43, she had been deserted by her husband. She was a Presbyterian from Tullylish, along with her children, Thomas, 10, Robert, 5, and Sarah, a year and a quarter. They all died in the workhouse. Eleanor Wright, 25, single, spinner, Protestant, healthy, from Bray, near Portadown. Anne Jane Wright, and 17 months old, that was Eleanor Wright, 25, and her child, Anne Jane, 17 months. They both died within days of each other in January 1847. Rose Corrigan, she was married. She was a weaver, a Catholic, union at large. She entered the workhouse. She was 45. She entered the workhouse with her daughter, Mary, 11, son, John, 18, and other son, Patrick, he was 20 months. They all died. Anne Best, she was 50. She was married, a winder, Protestant, from Kernan. She entered the workhouse with William, 9, Martha, 5, Elizabeth, 3. They all died. William Fox, 58, married, labourer, Catholic, from Kernan. Anne Jane Best, there was only one surviving member of the Best family. 5 of them died. The only survivor was Anne Jane. She was 12. She left the workhouse in August 1847. And lastly, Elizabeth McCann, 57, single, a sore, Protestant, from Carrabrack. That gives I think, a different perspective on when we're talking about the numbers that died, that here you had real people, names, the areas they came from, the conditions, where they, what they worked at, who their family were. And one of the things you find is, as you go through it, now that's 24. In the Lurgan Workhouse in 1847, and I've mentioned already about the workhouse registers not being fully filled out in February, March, April 47. There were at least 1,000, possibly 1,200 deaths in that 1 year in one workhouse. And that's just a fragment of those who died. So I think it puts real meat on the bones of those who died, to use a term, but also this idea that so many died. We're actually talking about real people here who lived their lives, who had their children, who were forced into an institution they never wanted to go. And actually, the chairman of the Mara, Workhouse Mara, just about 5 miles outside Lurgan, said, we refuse to send our poor to that house of mortality, as he referred to. So that's my talk for tonight. I hope it shed some light on an aspect of the Great Hunger in Ulster. And one of the things I take from this all the time is the fact that in Armagh and not too many other areas, we actually can dig into who these people were and put names to the otherwise anonymous numbers of thousands or a million. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Gerard. Gerard, there's just a few questions we'll go through. What is the name of the commission overseeing the workhouses?
They were the Poor Law Commissioners. They were based in Dublin.
So the Poor Law Commissioners. So someone asked, can you spell it? Poor Law. P-O-O-R-L-A-W. Yeah.
Yeah.
Poor Law Commissioners. Okay. And are there records for the people entering the workhouses in Donegal? Would I know? You're actually in
Letterkenny. There's one. The best records are for County Antrim and North Antrim. There's 5. Armagh, there's 2. Mahara-Felt, Enniskillen, none for Belfast. There's nothing for Derry. There's nothing for Tyrone. But Letterkenny and Donegal, there's one.
So there are some records, and if you wanted to try and access those records, where would someone start looking?
Well, can I just say that, people might wonder where those records went to, and I remember talking to a man in Monaghan in the late 90s when I was looking at working on the Famine in Ulster then, and he said that he remembered as a child in the 1940s cycling behind these big carts which were being drawn to a dump, and he said on the carts were huge books with gold clasps that had been taken out of the workhouses, and they were being converted into hospitals, and they were all burnt. And yes, it's shocking from one perspective that we lost those records, but people were so ashamed that they didn't. I've come across people saying, if you ever do research in the family tree, I don't want to mention how anybody was in the poorhouse or the workhouse. You can access them. Public Record Office in Belfast, the Donegal County Library, and there's also stuff in the National Archives.
So we're talking about the National Archives in Dublin.
National Archives in Dublin, but the main one would be for the north would be the Public Records Office in Belfast. So
that's a public. I just want to mention slowly. I'm just conscious that some of our listeners. So the Public Records Office in Belfast, and then you mentioned also in Donegal. So that's Donegal. Did you say Donegal?
Letterkenny, yeah.
In Letterkenny, did you say Donegal County Council was or Donegal?
That's the
Can you recall?
It would be the local library service in Letterkenny.
So the local library service in Letterkenny would be managed by Donegal County Council, if just anybody's inquiring about that. Another question is, you mentioned, sorry, just apologies, I think, what was the name of the book you mentioned at the very beginning of your talk, Gerard? Within, you mentioned there was an article about pre-famine life in Armagh. What was that?
Right. Well, that's a journal that's brought out every year, every 2 years in Armagh. The Shanahas Ard Waha. It's the Armagh Historical Journal. It's actually called Shanahas Ard Waha. S-E-R-N-C-H-I-S.
Sorry, can you slowly, please?
Yeah, S-E-R-N-C-H-I-S. The Shanahas, and then Ard, A-R-D, and then Waha, M-H-R-C-H-I.
I'll actually put that in an email later to everyone, just if anybody's interested.
It's Mendicity and Poverty in County Armagh.
Okay. And the Indian meal you mentioned, apologies, this is a question put in the comment, I'm not sure how to pronounce some of the words, but was Indian meal, would you know, was it treated with the likes of lime to help prevent any diseases?
All I know about the Indian meal that it was used because it was the cheapest food possible, but the poor didn't realize, the people who were going to eat it outside the workhouse, that it had to be boiled. It was rock hard.
Okay.
It had to be boiled over and over again before it became edible.
And probably because people were already suffering from malnutrition, so their bodies would have found it even harder to try and process and would have had a actually more severe impact on their systems. Yeah.
I just noticed there somebody said about the Dungannon.
Sorry, can you
Workhouse.
talk a little bit closer, sorry, to your screen, Gerard, and you're just suddenly going out of hearing?
No problem. No, I just noticed there about the Dungannon Workhouse register being online. There's actually a book of deaths from Dungannon, and each workhouse had a book of deaths, so that's available in the Public Records office in Belfast, the book of deaths for Dungannon. But the actual admission registers aren't. There aren't admission registers.
Just for anyone, Dungannon is a town in County Tyrone,
Yes,
in
sorry.
Ulster, just
Yeah.
for those of us.
Yeah,
Yeah. You mentioned Clan the Gael Club. Was this mentioned as you retrieved interviews, etc. from?
Basically all that was it was a digression from a researcher's point of view. What that was to just make the point that, you know, when you're researching a modern subject where people are still alive, that you can actually interview those people and get a different perspective as opposed to maybe what appears in a newspaper or whatever, whether it be a political perspective or a sporting perspective. And I use both of those in this book that I've just finished. But what the point I was making, that the nearest we can get to the people who actually were there in the workhouse are these admission registers, and in case, you know, in terms of their who they were.
Yeah. Someone actually commented here that thanks for highlighting the human dimension, names and fragments of lives, which should not be forgotten. I just want to just add that we mentioned that some information will be available within the Public Records Office in Dublin. I suppose make people aware too that unfortunately a lot of records were lost during the Civil War. Would that be correct? So,
Well,
or were they of this kind?
Well, I don't want to contradict you there, but certainly, and the records pertaining to this period were lost willfully. If we're looking at workhouse records, because there was this stigma of being in the workhouse, which was referred to by everybody locally in every area as the poor house. So nobody wanted, you know, by the time the 1940s came around, people just had this idea, we want to forget about that. So they threw the books out. There's a great collection in the National Archives in Dublin, the Relief Commission papers, which have been used extensively for each county. And also there's an even better collection in my view, which is the Society of Friends Relief of Distress papers, which is just a vast collection of papers, which deals with a lot of information locally, but also looking at the imports of food and how it was organized from America. A huge amount of information on that. But no, so there wouldn't have been an awful lot gone thankfully in the fire of 1922. The effect, I think all the information was seen.
Thank you. And in relation to accessing records on PRONI is a Public Records Office in Northern Ireland based in Belfast. Can you view them online? You can certainly visit the offices and access records.
Yeah, you can get a very brief synopsis if you type in a reference number or whatever. You know, they all come under BG for Board of Guardians. So you can start off with that online. But in terms of doing the research, no, maybe in the future. But at this stage, no. So what they will have there is the Board of Guardian minutes, which are very dry administrative books, but there's really good information in them, obviously, statistical information, etc. As I say, there are 12 in Ulster that have the admission registers, and then you also get some chaplains notebooks, a lot of in and out letters, but it's very dry sort of stuff. But certainly if you're looking for people are interested in family history and all that, you just need to ascertain what areas have are available for admission registers and take it from there. It is a trawl through them. There's been no index made of it or anything like that.
Okay. Someone else mentions here that just a comment, starvation diet, some details in relation to, let's say, for example, vitamin C deficiency can equal then organ failure, failure to relation to absorption of iron, leading to weakness,
Oh
Feel
yeah,
your
very much so. I
like
mean,
blood, just a ride. It's a kind of it's a cycle of a tipping point.
well, very
Deficiency
much
in
so.
one thing leads to other medical problems.
Yeah, well, what you had
Um,
certainly within the workhouse, and this happened outside the workhouse, but within the workhouse, if you look at it, one of the things I've looked at as well is the debt incurred by workhouses. That arises from the fact, number one, that there were huge numbers entering, but also that the expense of each pub was increasing. So prior to the famine, said the weekly cost of a pub would have been 9 pence, by early 1847, it's maybe 1 shilling and 7 pence. Why? Because they require medication. So if you multiply that increase by 500 people who wouldn't have been there otherwise, then they're looking to cut costs. So they introduced the cheapest meal, which is, nutritionally the poorest, which is Indian cornmeal, but they're not particularly worried about that as the Lurgan Workhouse illustrated, because they just want to feed them for as cheap a rate as they possibly can. And you find this then as you move through into 1847-48, the British government declares the famine over in August 47 because there's a successful crop, which is nonsense, of course, because the crop was minuscule compared to what was needed, but allows them to introduce what was called the Poor Law Extension Act, which meant that all relief had to be within the workhouse, but they also then allowed for outdoor relief for the first time. So they realized, what was happening here. I suppose it happened in various crises throughout the world with different governments. They were making policy on the hoof. They started off with the relief committees, subbing them, as it were, from 46 onwards, in the public works. Then they realised by January 47 we need to be feeding the people, so they introduced the Temporary Relief Act, also known as the Soup Kitchen Act. In March 47, they fed up to 3 million people between then and August, and then they shut it down. And it's actually, when you look at the letters coming in from people throughout the country, they can't believe it's being shut down, because we should have had this months before. Now you're actually feeding the people, you're saving thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives, keep it going, but they didn't. And they introduced the Temporary Relief Act, and that's where I keep making reference to the Society of Friends. Their papers show that they then provided huge amount of food and clothing throughout all counties right up until 1851, 1852. They provided grants, for example, in this local area, to the fishermen of Loch Ness to build boats. Not grants, actually. I was going to say grants to fishermen. Their names would still be in the same areas, to build boats so they could go pulling fishing in Loch Ness, because they realised that it wasn't a short-term fix, that it needed to be long-term. And after feeding the people, they then gave them clothes and then helped them establish model farms, various industries, etc. They did their best.
Thanks, Gerard. Just another comment is that there are some commissioner reports on a website, archive.org, for people for future reference. There's records of deaths on Dungannon Workhouse are also available. In relation, there's a website called dungannonworkhouse.com, and Clonus Library in County Monaghan has some records of some of the County Monaghan records.
Yes, and in fact, some of those have just been turned up in the last few years. If in terms of the workhouses in Carrickmacross, they've developed, they've basically revamped what was one of the wings of the workhouse, so you can do a tour of it. I did it a few years ago, and they focus on the orphan girls who went to Australia. So you can actually get a tour of the workhouse. There's also probably one of the best examples, untouched, of a workhouse. Certainly, the front building would be in Armagh, the primatial city of Armagh, where you've got the administrative block at the front, where it says the date above it, 1841. And then, and I've never seen this anywhere else, you've actually got where the people would have been laid out into, they were split up. So families were split up by gender and by age. So you have 4 distinct yards there with the walls still intact, and you've got the male, female for both girls, boys, men, and women. So I mean, that is worth a look. I don't think that's been highlighted. Actually, it's one of the best remaining examples of the workhouse administration built and the yards associated with it.
George, you mentioned a local historian called Charlie Dillon from the Moy
Yes.
in County Tyrone.
Yes.
Is that writings he has within, what's the organisation his work is based within?
He's involved with 2. He's involved with Comanchana Historic Waha, which would be the journal that I mentioned, the one that I had in. It also might be in an organisation called Dúcha Níl, which is the O'Neill Country Historical Society. It might actually be in that. But it'll be in one or other of those. But it's one of, sorry, go ahead.
And what was the name of it?
DU fada ICHE, Ducha, DU fada ICHE, and then Neil, NE fada ILL, Ducha Neil. It's the only country historical association or society based in around the Moy, Blackwater town, Benburb, that area.
Okay. And apologies everyone, I'm kind of quite close of time. Just someone has quickly asked, will we be looking at the 19th century census records? Unfortunately, won't be able to in this lecture series, but if the opportunity comes up to deliver organised further lectures in the future, it's certainly something I'll have on a list for us. I'm conscious everybody may want a rest break here, but just one final question. Any further plans to preserve what is left of Lurgan Workhouse? Unfortunately, I don't think this is a question we can answer. Have you any knowledge of that?
No, I remember being at an unveiling of a plaque there in the late, I think it was around about 1999 or 98, and I don't know what's happened to it. I know there were plans to maybe reinstate that or making it more prominent. But you know, in Carrick and Shannon, County Leitrim, the old workhouse there, which was also notorious for various reasons, and I think David might touch on these in his talk, and I can maybe mention what happened in Carrick as well. But they've taken a part of the workhouse, made it into the museum, so you can actually visit and see where the unfortunate people would have been at the time of the famine. Those attics are still there in the Lurgan Workhouse. I've been in them. I think it was the late 90s, early 2000s, but I visited those as well. So they're still there. So it's a case of obviously the hospitals, who they're owned by, etc. There's a lot of bureaucracy and red tape, but it would be nice to see, you know, something like that restored, so people could just get a feel of, you know, and maybe some sort of a memorial, given that we are fairly unique in having only 12 in Ulster out of 130 in the country, having the admission registers. So you could have the lists of names of everybody who died, and I think that would be a fitting testament to their
And just one very final question. What were the conditions for people who were, when the workhouse was full, maybe especially those who would have been turned away? I think it's very hard to really estimate for see how.
This was met with, you know, they were just absolutely aghast. The relief committees, once they were informed, and you can just imagine the workhouse is closed, because this is where, you know, people had to be investigated before they were allowed into the workhouse, their conditions and all that. And once they realised, right, we can't send our poor there anymore, so they're just going to come back on us. So the relief committees then were inundated, and that's why the British government was basically forced into establishing the Temporary Relief Act, where they fed people outside the workhouses, because they realised the workhouse system was never designed to deal with a catastrophe like the Great Hunger. And it'd be an interesting counterfactual exercise to look at, you know, would the deaths have been to the same extent without the workhouses? So Irish society without the workhouses, on the basis of, say, parochial relief, which had been there prior to 1838, and also which was still extant in Scotland. So, you know, the premise would be that the local people know their poor, they know their needs, and they can look after them, rather than build a huge building whereby cramming so many people in as you could. Obviously, then it was going to be widespread disease. So it'd be, you know, interesting counterfactual exercise.
Thank you very much, Gerard. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. David Broderick. David, his talk this evening, or maybe I say story this evening, is about the Master of Portumna Workhouse, Corruption and Exploitation. David is a historian and researcher from County Tipperary, who currently works at the Irish Workhouse Centre in Portumna in County Galway. David holds a master's degree in Public History and Cultural Heritage from the University of Limerick, and his book, Henry Ogle, The Mystery of the Disappearing Workhouse Master, published in 2019, is a study of the Portumna Workhouse in County Galway and its notorious master, Henry Ogle. If you'd be happy to start your talk, David.
Okay, Dolores, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And welcome everybody tonight, and special hello to Gerard there. And I enjoyed his wonderful talk. He's a fountain of knowledge. Most of that stuff, the vast majority of that, just came from his head, and very impressive. And I'm honoured to be in such great company tonight. So what I might do is I might just stop my video just to back up the strength of my bandwidth here, if that's okay. So I should be gone there now. And yeah, so if there's any problems, Dolores, you just let me know as we go along, okay? So I'm going to begin my talk, or as Dolores said, my story about the master of Portumna Workhouse, the infamous Henry Ogle, and the corruption and exploitation that he got up to. And again, I'm honoured to be speaking here tonight. So the workhouse, I'm not going to go to talk too much about the background of the workhouse, because Gerard has done a great job in giving the background of the workhouse system. I'll just use one quote here, and it's from John O'Connor's book on the workhouses of Ireland. And O'Connor says that the workhouse was the most feared and hated institution ever established in Ireland. And after listening to the previous speaker, we can understand why. And hopefully after this talk as well, we'll understand even a little bit more as to why the workhouse has come down to us so negatively in tradition and folklore. We can see just an image here on the left-hand side, and it's from Peter Higginbottom's website, workhouses.org, and Peter Higginbottom has done wonderful research on the workhouses in both Ireland and the UK. And here we have Oliver Twist in the bottom right-hand side, in that famous pose where he asks for more in the film by Charles Dickens's book on Oliver Twist. So I suppose it must be said that, you know, to be treated badly in a workhouse in Ireland, you know, the paupers in inverted commas were treated badly, but that was also the case in England. And I have visited a couple of workhouses in England as well, and you know, treated quite bad in the UK as well. Some of the terms that come up when we research the workhouses, and the backdrop here are dormitories in Portumna Workhouse. You know, there was disease, there was cholera, smallpox, dysentery, typhus. Again, Gerard mentioned that stigma. Stigma was a huge part of the workhouse. There's an old saying in Portumna, or an old story, that if you wanted to insult somebody in the pub while you were having a pint, you would say to him, be careful not to throw a stone over the wall of the workhouse. You might hit one of your own. It really was, you know, the kind of worst thing that could happen to somebody or to be associated with the workhouse. There was punishment, there was neglect, there was starvation. People were fed, but slowly starving. The amount of calories that were taken in per day, it's often suggested that they were actually being slowly starved to death. There was segregation, as Gerard touched on, and there was separation. Families were separated. There was cruelty, and again, malnutrition, hunger and cold. So on to the workhouse master. In 1840, the Poor Law Commissioner suggested non-commissioned army and constabulary officers would make the most suitable workhouse masters. His duties included keeping a register of all the paupers admitted, maintaining discipline, reading prayers to the paupers before breakfast and after supper, providing and enforcing the employment of the able-bodied paupers during the hours of labour, training the youth in keeping the partially disabled paupers occupied to the extent of their ability and preventing idleness at all time, reporting regularly to the guardians, procuring provisions and work material, supplying the names of boys and girls suitable for permanent employment outside the workhouse, etc. Our example, services and trades, notifying the medical officer of death and burying the paupers not removed by the family and sending them back to their electoral division. I'm sorry now, I'm just not seeing the very bottom of my lines of my slides, so sometimes I might have to leave out a short line. This is a quote from a poem in the Children's Folklore Collection, which is available online in Dukas, and again, a valuable source of local folklore and lots of references to the famine. This one is by James Turlin Billywood, and a couple of lines of pull from it. Speaking about the master, he says, he separates them and they must away. They hear his threats and trembling they obey. Without remorse his galing whip he yields. He wields oppression triumphs and compassion yields. So there's a lot of, as I mentioned, kind of negativity surrounding these workhouse masters, and we go back to where they're looking for constabulary or ex-military men to take up these roles, and oftentimes oftentimes these men were actually expelled from, you know, the army or the police force for being too heavy-handed. And these were the kind of guys that were taking over these roles in the workhouses. Because don't forget, as Gerard mentioned, some of the workhouses could hold 1,000 people. In the time of the famine, they were overcrowded. Maybe there could be up to 3,000 people. And literally one man was controlling these people. He would have an assistant master in some of the largest workhouses, but there might be just a porter, a schoolmistress, a nurse, and, you know, possibly a clerk or a priest on site. But this guy was in charge, and most of them, if not all, ruled with a kind of an iron fist. So Portumna Workhouse was built in 1852, one of the later workhouses. The earlier workhouses, was mentioned, they were built in the 1840s and were upstanding in the time of the famine. And it was seen then that more were needed because of the overcrowding experienced during the famine. So Portumna Workhouse was one of these plainer designs that was built. There was 30 of them built in some of the smaller towns in Ireland. Previously, the poor from the Portumna area or Portumna area would have went to Lurgan Workhouse, Ballinasloe, Scariff in County Clare, but now Portumna Workhouse opened in 1852 that was able to take in 600 people, and we have a number of, I think, 952 people entered the workhouse at the tail end of the famine in 1852. So I started in Portumna Workhouse in 2017 as a researcher, basically, and I would do some touring as well, or tour guiding. But to be honest, I found the experience quite heavy. I'm a very kind of a positive character and happy-go-lucky, and I love history. I love it, but I suppose I just found this very dark. I found it, anyone that has visited a workhouse, or maybe a mass grave from the time of the famine, or these sites that are associated with the famine and such suffering, or, you know, indeed concentration camps in Poland or elsewhere, you would feel that kind of heaviness or that kind of sadness, and that's exactly what I felt here. I had decided to leave after a week or so. I just found, given the tours, there was no way of kind of creating any sort of positive spin on the story. The one thing that did occur to me, though, was that the tours were literally about the dates and the workhouse system. Very little specifically about the people from Portumna Workhouse, because like so many, we have lost our records, even though our workhouse stands, our records are gone. And that can be the opposite in some cases, that there are cases where the records survive, but the workhouses are gone. So Portumna is open to the public as a kind of a site. Half it is developed as a tourist destination. And for me, yeah, as I said, I was going to leave after a week. But before I left, I had one kind of private tour on my own through all the buildings, including the one we're looking at here. And that's the boys block. And at the very end of it is the master's house. And it's still to this day known as Ogle's house. So even though he left in 1865, it's still known as Ogle's house. And as I was shadowing some tours at the start, the tour guides would mention Henry Ogle and how he disappeared. And I would ask the question of where he went to, and nobody could tell me. And I just became very intrigued with this guy. And something kind of dawned on me on that tour I had of, you know, that myself through the buildings, that possibly if I could start researching into the stories of these people, that I could possibly bring their stories to life, and possibly, as I ended up doing a publication, we've done some short films, radio documentaries, storyboards, and slowly we're bringing these people back to, you know, we're remembering these people. So to start my research, I had to start at the beginning, and I found this newspaper clipping from 1850, and it was proposed by Mr. Eyre and seconded by Major Burke that Mr. Henry Ogle be appointed Master of the Union. Mr. Ogle was an efficient officer in Ballinasloe and a first-rate Protestant. Proposed by Mr. MacDermott and seconded by Captain MacDonagh that Mrs. Owens be appointed matron, for if the Master was a first-rate Protestant, he could say for Mrs. Owens that she was a right good Catholic. And the building at the back is known locally as St. Molasses College. And something I found, the fact that Ogle was appointed and Mrs. Owens was appointed in 1850 quite strange, that they were being appointed and paid for 2 years previous to the workhouse being open. So I did a little bit of digging, and I actually found that at the back of this building we're looking at here was an old disused distillery. And this went uncovered for years, that there was actually a temporary workhouse, confirmed to me in the newspapers that there was a lease on this distillery for 2 years. So it brought us back into the famine period, that Henry Ogle had become the first master of Portumna temporary workhouse in 1850. And the numbers for that distillery, or basically a glorified shed, were up to 1,000 people. And like most distilleries, they're often close to water, and the conditions in there would be quite bad and quite damp, and sickness would prevail. So to find the Ogles, and I had one huge advantage. His name was Ogle. If his name was Kelly or Horan or something like that down in Galway, I'd have been lost straight away before I even started, but his name was Ogle. So a quick look at Griffith's valuation, which was kind of a valuation on land, or a land tax in the 1850s, but a valuable source all the same. A quick look in that, and for the Ogle family, came up with one family of Ogles living between Ballinasloe and Portumna. So I was quite excited. I said, you know, have I actually found where they came from? Because the tradition surrounding Ogle at Portumna had said that he was an Englishman, and of course nobody would like to admit that he was actually a Galway man just living down the road. It was easier to say that he was an Englishman, and dismiss him away as not being one of our own, but in fact he was. And what was important then, when I went and found the baptismal records in the local church, was in 1824, Jonathan Ogle and Jane Campion gave birth to a son, Henry. I then found the house. I contacted the farmer and found the house where the Ogle family had grown up, and I stood in the house and went to visit it. And so literally I had the start of the story, where Henry Ogle was more than likely born and definitely reared. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, we have St. Matthew's Cemetery in Glan, where the family plot is, but Henry Ogle was not with them. And just a little interesting side note, there is a headstone in that graveyard for the Rourke family, spelled differently than what the Rourkes would be spelled locally, R-O-R-K-E. And one of those guys went to Africa, and a place was named after him called Rourke's Drift. So the historians online will recognize that as the site of that famous battle with the British Army and the Zulus. Just a little side snippet. I then was very lucky to find that there was still one Ogle family living in the area. That man we're looking at here beside me, that's me on the left, and in the middle there is Jimmy Ogle. So Jimmy passed away last year, unfortunately, and I suppose I'd like to dedicate this talk to Jimmy, because he was a great help and very welcoming. And I told him the story of Henry Ogle, and you know, I was tiptoeing around the fact that his ancestor was a bit of a black sheep and didn't seem to bother Jimmy, but Jimmy gave me lots of help. He produced his picture on the opposite side of his great grand uncle. Now this was a nephew of Henry Ogle, but you can almost see the resemblance between Jimmy and this guy. So we were kind of trying to build a picture of what Henry Ogle looked like, because to date I have failed to find a photograph of Henry Ogle. But I'm 5'11". Jimmy is a good 6 foot there, and he was well in his 70s. So I'm guessing that these were from kind of, you know, strong stock, as would have been suggested earlier on, that these workhouse masters were big, strong characters. So next I found that Henry Ogle had actually married Mary Jane Duffy in January 1862, and her occupation was matron of the workhouse. And that corrected some false information that we had understood to this point, that it had said that Henry Ogle was married to the matron, Mrs. Owens, who came from Ballinasloe Witten. But of course, if we look at that more closely, Mrs. Owens was more than likely married to Mr. Owens. So Henry Ogle, Protestant, marries Mary Jane Duffy, a Catholic, in 1862. They have 3 children, all baptized in the local Catholic Church. John T was baptized in December 1862, Maria February 1st, 1864, and you'll see a little red line underneath where I've marked the priest's name, Father Patrick Donnellan, and he'll come into play pretty soon. And Henry Jr. was born in 1865. So Ogle, a cruel master. This is a snippet from the London Illustrated Times referring to Portumna Workhouse in 1864. They say, Such is the insight into which we are favoured into the working of the poor law of our sister country. We thought it bad enough on our own, but it seems that Whitechapel or Bethnal Green may be reckoned a paradise by comparison. Now that's a pretty damning a report from the London Illustrated Times, because these two workhouses in Whitechapel and Bethnal Green are two of the most notorious workhouses in the UK, and all sorts of terrible stories are coming from them. But they're actually saying in this snippet here, the Portumna Workhouse is the worst of all the workhouses in the UK and Ireland in 1864. And why? Well, it seems to be down to one man, this Henry Ogle, who has after a few years become clerk of the workhouse as well. So he has the joint role of master and clerk, in an attempt to save money by the Poor Law Union. They've made this huge mistake in giving him full control. This is a snippet from the report from the Court of Petty Sessions on the 13th of February 1854, where Ogle takes a case against William Larkin for stealing £1.16. Larkin is sentenced to be flogged and receives 1 month in Galway prison. William Larkin is 12 years old. Out of all the cases that I've come across under Henry Ogle's time, this is definitely the most poignant and the saddest of them all, is the death of 1-year-old Patrick Hara in Portumna in November 1864. So Patrick Hara is brought to the doors of the workhouse by his mother, Mary. She's refused admission to the workhouse because she doesn't have a relieving officer's ticket. Anyone who enters the workhouse is supposed to have a ticket from the relieving officer, but she couldn't get one because it was the weekend and he was away. So she goes to the union doctor, Dr. Coates, and again, she's turned away. So she has no choice but to go back to her house or shed. She's actually living in a shed in somebody's garden. The conditions in this shed are absolutely horrendous, and the little boy dies. The coroner's report in 1864 says that the child had died for the want of the common necessities of life. When she's asked why didn't she come to the poorhouse or the workhouse earlier, Mary Hara replies, "'Tis little you know what a poorhouse is. It is the last shift for the poor to go to the workhouse." So she's basically saying if she had went to the workhouse earlier, she would have died anyway, because conditions were so bad in there. And look, they were bad all over the country, but Portumna, as is seen here, is one of the worst. Conditions are absolutely, horrendous. Mortality rate is extremely high, and she's saying it here as well. And it's one of the saddest stories of the whole period under Henry Ogle. Another tragic story is Kitty Kelly and Bridget Grimes. They both die at Portumna in January 1865. And I'm going to read a newspaper, a letter that was sent into the newspaper by Father Patrick Donnan, the man that had actually baptized Henry Ogle's daughter just a couple of years previous. So it's Portumna, the 10th of January 1865. "Gentlemen, I wrote to you on the 3rd instant, informing you that 2 poor women were carted to the Portumna Workhouse on the 28th of December last, a cold and frosty day without any covering except their own clothes, and that one of them, Kitty Kelly, 70 years of age, died on the 2nd. I have now to inform you that the other poor woman, named Bridget Grimes, died between 8 and 9 o'clock a.m. today. If there was no other attention paid to this report except that what was paid to that on the 3rd instance, I shall feel constrained in the interest of the poor to appeal to the public press for protection. To prove to you the necessity of taking notice of these 2 cases, I may tell you, I also remember a young girl who was carted to the Portumna poorhouse for several miles. She arrives at the poorhouse on a cold winter's night, about 9 o'clock, I think. I administered sacraments to her between 10 and 11 o'clock the same night, and she died between 1 and 2 the next morning. I remain, gentlemen, your obedient servant, Patrick Donlan, CC." So what Donlan is edging at here, and it's reported in other letters, and again there's an inquest into this, that these 2 women were sent for by the hospital ambulance, which was of course should have been a horse and trap. But it is said that Henry Ogle would not pay for a horse, that it was too expensive to feed, so he had a donkey and trap. So by the time that the donkey and trap got out to these women who could have been up to 10 miles away, And they never brought blankets either. He wouldn't pay for blankets to be sent out. These women literally died of exposure, and they were asked themselves why they left it so late, or when one of them was actually alive when she came in for a while. She was asked, why did she leave it so late to ask for help? And they replied that they wanted to come to the workhouse under the cover of darkness. They did not want to be seen. Again, this is relating back to the stigma surrounding the workhouse. Father Donlan created a huge stir, basically. He wasn't afraid to kind of report what was going on into the workhouse. It was making the newspapers in England, and the Liverpool Daily Post on the 26th of July 1864, it made the front page, and the headline was "The Reason Why People Are Immigrating from Ireland." And for me, one of the biggest reasons why people are immigrating from Ireland, why so many people immigrated from Ireland, was because of these workhouses too. Because what options did they have? You know, go to the workhouse or try and survive outside or be evicted. Now, of course, they needed some sort of passage to be paid for them, be it assisted passage or be it remittance from somebody who had already made it over to America. But nobody wanted to go into the workhouse, definitely by their own choice. It says that last week an investigation took place in the boardroom into a charge made by a priest as to the badness and deficiency of food supplied to the paupers. The inquiry originated in a letter published in the Munster News by Mr. O'Donnell, Reverend Mr. O'Donnell. Mr. Burke, the inspector, presided. The workhouse door was beset by a body of people, perhaps 1,000 in number, and egress and access was nearly impractical. Some miserable creatures were produced as witnesses, but it is unnecessary to record their depositions because the infamy of the system is indicated in the evidence for the defence. Mrs. Kavanagh, the head nurse, made tea for the patients, and it could not have been very difficult to make, for a gallon of water was poured on an ounce of tea. Incredible but true. When asked if she drank that tea herself, she was startled and replied, "Oh God, no." So Father Patrick Donlan, one who hates oppression. So in his initial letters, Father Patrick Donlan signed off as one who hates oppression. Eventually, everybody knew in the area who was writing these letters, so he just signed himself as Father Patrick Donlan, CC. As I mentioned earlier, he was not afraid of, you know, blowing the whistle of what was going on in the workhouse. Now, I'm not saying Portumna Workhouse was the worst of all workhouses at that time. There was probably as many, you know, as bad, if not worse. But a workhouse needs a whistleblower. The famous George Catch, who inspired Charles Dickens from Strand Union Workhouse, there was a whistleblower, I forget, Dr. Rogers, I think, blew the whistle on what was happening in Strand Union Workhouse. It was the same in Andover in England, Colin McDougall, that famous case in Andover, where the inmates were actually eating the kind of marrow, the rotting marrow from the bones that they were supposed to be grinding down for fertilizer. There was a whistleblower there, one of the Board of Guardian members blew the whistle into what was happening there. This stuff was going on all over the country, in the UK and Ireland, but it took somebody brave enough to blow the whistle. Donlan had grown up in the Irish famine. He had seen the horrors of it. He was from County Galway, not far from Portumna, in the Portumna Poor Law Union, and he went to join the missions. So he went to All Hallows in Drumcondra, and their motto was to go teach all nations. And just to explain, I suppose, how their life was, I have some snippets here. And it says, life was extremely difficult for these young missionary priests. In the huge spaces of North America and Australia, the priests were badly housed and badly cared for, and were forced to cope with the heat and cold of a foreign clime while travelling vast distances on horseback over dirt roads to minister to their impoverished flocks. Few of them lived long enough to reach middle age. Together with the Sisters of Mercy, they performed valiant services amongst the sick and wounded soldiers of both sides of the battlefield and in the various camps and hospitals. Father Donlan went to Virginia, Fairfax, Virginia, and he had now got caught up in the American Civil War. His church was St. Mary's Church, and it says here was one of those repurposed churches operated as a hospital or field hospital, and it was described by his bishop, Bishop McGill. He says, the floors and walls of St. Mary's Church, Fredericksburg, were literally besplattered with the blood of the wounded and dying soldiers, brought there for hospital treatment. So not only had Father Donlan lived through the famine as a young man and seen the horrors, as I've mentioned, he's now in Virginia in the heart of the American Civil War. He's watching his church, being turned into this field hospital. He's sent back then, probably for his own safety or by request, we're not sure, to Portumna, and he takes up the role of CC and he makes his way into the workhouse. And he has no fear. He's possibly traumatized from what he's seen, but he definitely has no fear in taking on the likes of Henry Ogle or the Board of Guardians and reporting into the newspapers of what he's seeing. So eventually, I've only covered a few, but there was numerous inquests and inquiries. Ogle keeps getting away with a slap on the knuckles. I'm convinced that he had strong connections locally in the kind of hierarchy. I did find after I printed my book that he was actually a Freemason, which again would kind of cement that theory, because he was never really pulled in for what he had done. But all this pressure literally took its toll on him. This is a timeline up to the point where he actually absconds, because the master of Portumna Workhouse famously absconded in June 1865. On May the 17th, the board met to discuss dissolving the union. So it's possible that Portumna Workhouse Union or Portumna Union, Poor Law Union, could have been dissolved. Then all the books would have to be shown and closed. So it strongly suggested that Henry Ogle was fiddling the books and probably had been doing it for the time that he had, the 8 years that he had been both clerk and workhouse master, that he was skimming, that he was supposed to be buying in proper quality food. He wasn't. He was buying in this blue moldy food that was literally being skipped and dumped before the Poor Law commissioners could see it. The hospital, these are some of the conditions that Father Donlan talks about. The hospital had a high mortality rate because he reckons the beds were in dirty, wet conditions. They were cold, filthy and damp. The food was dreadful. The bread was hard and mouldy. Kitty Madden told him that her invalid daughter could not eat the food, and they would leave the workhouse and try and survive on the outside on berries alone. Henry Ogle had actually dumped a cartload of blue molded bread before the commissioners could see it. John Howard, another inmate, told Father Donlan that he was so thirsty that he resorted to drinking his own urine. When asked why Howard was left the workhouse with no shirt on his back, Henry Ogle replied, well, he did not enter with one. The paupers were also regularly placed in solitary confinement, strategically placed beside the unemptied cesspools where the stench was overbearing. So every little thing that Henry Ogle could do to save money and possibly put money away, he was doing. But this was at the cost of the paupers and sometimes to their lives. For example, when he turned away little Patrick Harrop because he wouldn't let him in, he wouldn't feed him, because literally, if he was skimming the money, he was seeing this extra money that would be taken from him if he was feeding more paupers. On the 3rd of June, Ogle and the board met to receive and consider tenders to build an infirmary kitchen. And again, the tenders would have to be brought in kind of sealed envelopes from the local builders. Oftentimes they would be, accompanied by, in inverted commas, a brown envelope or maybe some cash to ensure that they would get the job. So that was the last act Ogle had before he absconded. Now, a very interesting thing happened here. We see on June the 4th, David Breen, the Ballinasloe Workhouse Master, is arrested for murder. I have a snippet here from the newspaper which says the arrest of the master and schoolmistress of Ballinasloe. The master, David Breen, and Miss Dunn, the schoolmistress, have been arrested about 3 hours ago for the murder of the infant found in the retiring room or toilet on Wednesday last. It appears that on the night of Thursday, the day after the last inquest was held, the master revealed to his wife that he carried out an illicit intercourse with Miss Dunn, and the said result of her becoming pregnant by him. So don't forget that Henry Ogle was the former assistant master of Ballinasloe Workhouse. He was literally from that area. Whether there was any connection between Ogle and David Breen, I'm not sure, but certainly the Poor Law commissioners would have been down like a ton of bricks on this. There would have been police, everything. There would have been a huge kind of an incident surrounding Ballinasloe Workhouse. So Henry Ogle, for some reason, be it a combination of all these things, absconds from Portumna Workhouse on the 8th of June, 1865. This is the famous newspaper clipping. That's all we had. This is all we were aware of what had happened to him. And it says, the mysterious disappearance of the master of Portumna Workhouse. Mr. Henry Ogle, for many years the clerk of the union and master of the workhouse of Portumna, has absconded in a most mysterious manner. On Thursday morning last, he took a car at the hotel and drove to Birr, where he discharged the car and nothing more was heard of him till Saturday, on which date his wife, who is the matron of the house, received a letter bearing the Liverpool postmark, telling her to go and reside with her father till she would hear from him. All sorts of conjecture and gossip are afloat respecting the absent man, but one thing appears to be agreed on by all, that money matters have nothing to do with his flight. His accounts are said to be in a most satisfactory state, and it is understood that he has left a large sum in the bank and in railway shares, and a half year's salary for himself and his wife is still in the hands of the guardian. While it is said in that newspaper statement that the accounts are in order, not so long after that point, it is said in another newspaper clipping that the workhouse accounts are in a most unsettled state. Another newspaper runs with the line that the master of Portumna Workhouse has taken French leave. But other than this, there's almost a silence, almost an eerie silence about Henry Ogle. What has happened? There's one new little clip to say that his wife was suspended from her role, but then taken back on when they're happy that she had nothing to do with his departure. And it seems that Henry Ogle has actually left the workhouse high and dry. The accounts are literally cleared out, and he has left his wife with 3 small children to look after, and he's abandoned her. So where did Henry Ogle go? So for me, this was the biggest part of the story. If we could just find where he left. So the first thing I went back to was that newspaper clipping to see was there a clue in there. And there was a big clue in there, of course. It said the Liverpool postmark. Now, Henry Ogle was obviously a clever individual. He wasn't going to stay in Liverpool. If he did, the police would have picked him up pretty much straight away. So by the time he had posted this letter, I presumed that he was on his way. Obviously, Liverpool is a major shipping town, city. So where do you go in 1865 if you got money in your pocket and you want to get away? So of course we guessed America. If you're going to America, we guessed New York or Boston. New York was the first guess. So a quick search on Ancestry, and we got the shipping records and found a week after Henry Ogle left the Portumna Workhouse, there was a Henry Ogle, age 35, the same age, on a boat called the City of Manchester. His occupation, in inverted commas, a shoemaker. Could this possibly be our Henry Ogle? I strongly believe it was. As a researcher, sometimes you get a hunch that you're on the right track, and I was pretty much convinced it was. So Henry Ogle, had he escaped to New York City? So what I needed to do then was check the census and stuff in New York. But before I did that, we found out that Henry's wife, Mary Jane, had also entered through Castle Gardens on January the 1st, 1866. There's nothing in the newspapers about this either. So this seems to have been pre-arranged. Obviously, he was true to his word. He had wrote a letter back to his wife, and she makes her way over to New York. Interestingly, when we see the shipping record, there's a Peter Durbin Witter, there's a Anne Duffy Witter, don't forget her maiden name is Duffy, and there appears to be a woman in the middle as well, Bridget Conway. These are all Galway names. It appears that she's gone over with 3, if not 4 other people as well, and one of these guys appears on the later census. Now, just to follow the timeline, in 1866, in July, Father Patrick Donlan passes away. He's made his way back to Virginia. I think he possibly was sent from Portumna because he caused such a stink. He made his way back to Virginia, and it's reported in the Fredericksburg Ledger that they regret to say that the overpowering intensity of the heat, Father Patrick Donlan, the priest in charge of the Catholic Church in this place, has fallen victim. Basically, Father Donlan was on a boat called the Vanderbilt, as we see it there on the left-hand side, and he was making his way from one parish to another when he succumbed to literally heat exhaustion, and he was only 36 years old. It was actually harder to find Patrick Donlan and where he came from and where he ended up than Henry Ogle, believe it or not. But we finally found his headstone in Virginia. And this is a project that we're working on with the Order of Ancient Hibernians, I think, in Virginia, who we're hoping to get the stone resurrected in his memory, because undoubtedly Father Patrick Donlan has saved many lives in Portumna Workhouse with his intervention. So in the 1870 census, we find Henry Ogle is now living in Lower Manhattan, possibly the poor side of Manhattan in a large Irish area. He's working as a clerk in store. His wife is there, Mary Jane, keeper of the house. The 3 children are there. And on the bottom, we have Edward Dervin, as I mentioned, who came on the boat with Mary Jane. And he's also working as a clerk in store. So it appears that Henry is doing what he loves best. And again, he's handling cash. The 1880 census, then we also find Henry Ogle and we find Mary and we find John, but Henry Jr. is missing from this one. And that kind of raised my eyebrow on that one. So we'll deal with it in a couple of minutes. At this stage, Henry Ogle has moved further up into Midtown Manhattan. He's living in one of these brownstone houses. For us, I suppose, growing up, we maybe recognized one of these houses in a show like The Cosby Show. I didn't notice until I made my way to New York. You know, this was the kind of the rich part of New York. And Henry Ogle had literally made his way up from Lower East Side Manhattan, right all the way up into the center of town. Excuse me. So at this stage, in around this time, Henry Ogle becomes a tenement rent collector. A little quote here about these tenements that were literally full of Irish people, Italians, but there was a huge amount of Irish. It says here in How the Other Half Lives by Jacob A. Rees. It says that disease was rampant in the tenements. Tenant houses were nests of fever, infection, and the poisoned abodes of physical decay. And in 1865, a report questioned that the entire tenement house population was devastated by the domestic petulances and infectious epidemics that arise from overcrowding and uncleanliness. And I feel that what led to Henry Ogle's downfall, as we'll find out. Now, in 1877, Henry Ogle and Mary Jane lose their child, Henry. Remember, I mentioned in previous slides that he was missing from the 1880 census. So we started researching. A friend of mine, Diane Russo-Karpozowicz in America, helped me out with a lot of the stuff in New York City where I couldn't get to. And she found this death record for young Henry, who had passed away at the age of 12. So even though the Ogles were moving up into Midtown Manhattan and he was working away and probably comfortable dealing in a cash job again, we could say they were living the American dream, but then their fortunes start to turn and they lose their child, Henry. We lose the Ogles then. In history, the sources go dry. We can't find them. There's, I think, the 1890 census, if I'm not wrong, were destroyed in New York, but we lost them and there was nothing, there was no trail. The paper trail went dry. So we thought that was the end of the story, until purely by chance I came across a newspaper, a clipping from the New York Times in 1906 that reports a funeral of a Mary Jane Ogle, who's widow of Henry Ogle. And basically what happens here is there's a funeral worker strike in May 1906. These guys called the Cavaliers, obviously Irish undertakers, break the picket and basically decide that they're going to, work the funeral. So it gives the address of where they're living, where the Ogles are living, and they talk about bringing the coffin to St. Agnes's Church on 45th Street in New York. So when this happens, there's almost a riot with the picketing funeral workers. So the people in New York, it's kind of rush hour at the time, they realize what's happening and they actually come out and protect the funeral cortege. And that's why it enters into the newspaper as an extraordinary funeral. But what it does for us is it gives us an address where they were living in 1906. It gives us the church where the funeral was held. Don't forget, Mary Jane was a Catholic. But crucially, it says that Mrs. Ogle, the body of Mrs. Ogle, was sent to Woodlawn Cemetery over the New York Central Railway. When the body leaves the church, the people outside, up to 1,000 people, follow the cortege and protect it from the picketers and see her off on the train. But most importantly for us, it points us to Woodlawn Cemetery. Now, Henry Ogle was a Protestant, she was a Catholic, you know, were they buried together? And this for me was very exciting. Had we actually found Henry Ogle after all these years? So I rang my friend Diane, I think it was January 2000 and possibly 18 when this happened. There was maybe 2 foot of snow in New York at the time, so she couldn't make it to Woodlawn, and eventually she did. So I made it over to New York myself in 2018. I met Diane, and I'm forever grateful to her, because we literally had a whistle-stop tour of New York City. I had recording equipment with me because there was a radio documentary funded by Galway Bay FM by Sally Ann Barrett, produced it, and I was recording it as I went, and we had a wonderful time kind of chasing ghosts around New York City. Basically, we went to St. Agnes's Church to do some recording and just to see the place where this remarkable funeral took place, and only for it we wouldn't have completed our story. I entered inside and there was mass on, and it was in Latin actually, and I just stood at the back of the church and recorded the Latin mass, and the hymns actually added greatly to the documentary, and I just got a feel and tried to imagine what this was like the time of her funeral. What caught my eye was a baptismal font in the corner as well, and another little side snippet. It said at this baptismal font, the Irish patriot Eamon de Valera was baptized on December 3rd, 1882, another snippet. So we made our way to Woodlawn Cemetery to see could we finally catch up with the notorious workhouse master Henry Ogle and finish our story. And here I have Diane standing beside a grave slab. She had actually found the headstone for me and sent back a video to us in Portumna. And there was great excitement that day in the workhouse when I opened this video, and we waited for all the staff to come in. And it was quite strange, a quite strange feeling being there. I had found him. I had found his wife. Mary Jane was buried with him. Henry had died on April 9th, 1896, aged 65 years old. And for me, this was the end of the story, and quite a fitting end that we had actually, you know, found where he came from and found, you know, where he ended up. And if you see the little grave slab, you'll see a tiny little red arrow I've pointed there, a little stone. When I went to his grave site, I wanted to bring something from Portumna. You know, not to be disrespectful either, but I brought a small little stone from the solitary confinement in Portumna Workhouse from the girls' yard, and I just placed it beside the slab as just a little memento to say that Portumna Workhouse had finally caught up with Henry Ogle. But that was not the end of the story. There we have another look at the headstone. Henry Ogle died April 9th, 1896, and Mary Jane died May 8th, 1906. What was remarkable was when we found, again thanks to Diane, we found the death records of Henry Ogle. He's mistakenly called Andrew in one part, but then it confirms he's Henry on the other part. He's 65 years old, he's white, he's married, he's a collector as occupation, he's from Ireland, 32 years in New York City. Jonathan is his father and Jane is his mother, and it gives his address, and it says he dies from acute dysentery and senile dementia. So quite a rough end. If we're familiar with those diseases, that they're quite rough. And I mentioned that possibly working in the tenements was his downfall. Possibly he picked up dysentery working in the tenements, because it would have been rampant in the tenements at those times. And they say that in the research I've done, that, you know, chronic dysentery can actually bring on dementia. So it's possibly this is what was his downfall. But it says his place of death was Manhattan State Hospital on Ward's Island. So just to get a kind of a photograph, I suppose, of where he died and can maybe finish the story there, I just Googled the hospital and it came up with this, that it was the New York Asylum for the Insane. So Henry Ogle had actually died in an asylum for the insane on Ward's Island in New York. To get an idea of what conditions were like in one of these asylums, I bought a book called 10 Days in a Madhouse by Nellie Bly. And this is when a few coincidences started kind of coming through. This was a very strange story. It literally unfolded right in front of me. Nellie Bly is literally buried, you know, a couple of meters from Henry Ogle. She was a journalist and an investigative journalist, and she tricked her way into one of these asylums in around the time Henry Ogle died. On Ward's Island. There was one for the women, I think, on Randall's Island, close by. She tricked her way in. She had no problem pretending she was crazy, and she wrote an account about her 10 days in a madhouse. The problem was she was sane, and when she wanted to leave, she couldn't convince them that she was sane. And she struggled to get out, and she did obviously get out. And she writes about a lot of people who were actually in there, and Irish girls that were actually, you know, might have just got in trouble or might have just got drunk, but were actually perfectly sane, but could not get out of this asylum. Now, she mentioned the conditions in the asylum, and I'm just going to read out some of them if I can find them here. No, they're on my slide, sorry. The following are some of the accounts given by Nellie Bly. On bathing day, the tub is filled with water and the patients are washed one after another without change water. This is done until the water is thick and then is allowed to run out and the tub is refilled without being washed. The patients who are not able to take care of themselves get into beastly conditions and the nurses never look after them, but order some of the patients to do so. After breaking a window, I was transferred to the lodge, the worst place on the island. It is dreadfully dirty in there and the stench is awful. In the summer, the flies swarm the place. The food is worse than we get in other wards, and we are given 10 plates. When we got into the dining room, at least we found a bowl of cold tea, a slice of buttered bread, and a saucer of oat milk with molasses on it for each patient. I was hungry, but the food would not go down. The bread was hard in places, and in places nothing more than dry dough. I found a spider in my slice, so I did not eat it. I tried the molasses, the oatmeal and molasses, but it was wretched. I can't read the rest of the line there, but you can see what I'm getting at here. These are literally almost like, you know, they're pretty much the same words as what Father Patrick Donlan was reporting from the workhouse in the time of Henry Ogle. These conditions would have been quite similar to the conditions that Henry Ogle died in on Ward's Island. So literally, you know, I suppose the word karma comes to mind if people believe in that, but the whole thing had done the full circle. It is still, Ward's Island still is a psychiatric hospital. I couldn't take a photograph of it, but this is a photograph I just took of the barrier that separates people from the outside world, and it kind of symbolizes just what these institutions are like even nowadays. So the Ogle story comes to an end in New York City. Henry Ogle had died, you know, an awful death, really, in a mental asylum. Mary Jane had died in 1906 and had an extraordinary funeral. Young Henry had died in 1877, aged 12 years old. Maria had got married, but the marriage broke down and she had no children. And then John Thomas, who also became a worker, he was an inspector in the tenements. He married twice and had 3, if not 4 children, and all those children died in infancy. So the Ogle story came to an end eventually in New York City. So just a quote from Galatians 6:7, whatever a man soweth, that he shall also reap. Now, if you've enjoyed this story and you want to hear more, there is a link here on the Galway Bay FM website. I have the links here, and it's basically a radio documentary that was done on this, and it's a 2-hour, 2 parts, 1 hour in each part, done by Sally Ann Barrett, and it was shortlisted for an IMRO, basically the National Radio Awards in 2020. And it just, if anybody is interested in hearing more of the story, you will find it there. And I just want to say thank you very much, and that's the end.
Thank you very much, David. That link for the podcast. I'll have that sent out via email also, so people will be able to listen to it. Certainly I'll listen to it. I think it'll be very interesting. Someone actually asked, David, had Ogle any connections in Armagh? Now, I don't know if you can go back that far, but it wouldn't be a common surname, so you never know, you know.
Yeah, look, it's
Ogle
hard.
wouldn't be common at all.
It's not common at all. And I had a very friendly gentleman down from the north of Ireland. He was a minister for a tour, I think last year, and he informed me that the name Ogle, you know, and I was aware that there was a town in the north of England called Ogle, but he reckons that there were border reivers, that there were raiders, that they would raid into Scotland and stuff. So there were a kind of notorious clan of I won't say villains, but there were tough cookies. Now there's a Brendan Ogle, I think, that has, you know, been I think he's involved in the unions and that kind of thing in the Republic. But I have made no connection so far to the north of Ireland. But it is strongly suggested that the Ogles arrived in County Galway in Aughrim. And we'll be familiar with the Battle of Aughrim that came after the Battle of the Boyne, and that as payment to some of the soldiers that they actually received land. Maybe some of the higher ranking soldiers actually received land in that particular area, and that the Ogle family were one of them. That's possibly where they came over with the Williamites back in the 1690s.
Because just someone mentioned there are Ogles buried in Lurgan, Shankill Cemetery in Lurgan. So, and that would be a very old graveyard. So there could be connections there going back. Just mentioning too, there were some comments that for people listening, the workhouse in Bonboy is Bawnboy in County Cavan. Yeah, it's well preserved and a good example of a scale of what a workhouse would have been like. And there is also a Famine museum in Donaghmore, County Laois. So Donaghmore would be DONAGHMORE museum.ie, which would also be very informative for people. Just looking at my notes.
Just on that note, Bonboy is an exact replica of Portumna Workhouse.
Okay, I don't think interesting.
Yeah, because they were one of the later workhouses. So some of our buildings that are missing, sometimes we refer to Bonboy for photographs. I don't think Bonboy is open to the public at the moment. Donaghmore is probably, and there's an agricultural museum there as well in Laois, in the one in Donaghmore. And we'll be open ourselves from the 1st of March this year, if anybody wants to come down for a trip.
There was the question, was there any link with Mount Bellew Workhouse and specifically Dennis Kelly, landlord who was a Board of Governors there, and from Ballygar, County Galway? Does that sound at all familiar to you?
I wouldn't be familiar. I'm familiar with Mount Bellew and I'm familiar with Ballygar. I'm not familiar with Dennis Kelly. Even though I was in Ballygar only last week at a funeral of a lady called Kelly. But I know there is on Facebook a Mount Bellew Workhouse project. There is a good society there in Mount Bellew, so I'm sure they'd have the records. Now there's also in Galway, the Galway County Council website, they have some of the records for some of the workhouses as well in County Galway. So definitely whoever has that query, they should start Googling, and they should be able to get some information there.
We just discovered too there are Ogles in Donaghcloney, which is also in our council area. So maybe
very good. They won't be happy with me when they hear what I've been saying.
Maybe this is Ogle country up here, you know. So I'm just running through the questions here. Sorry, have I missed? There's a lot of comments that people have enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much, David. A fascinating story. Someone saying here, I worked in Portumna for a couple of years in the 90s, and at the time the workhouse history was never mentioned. This is from John, who's in the chat. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get the message up. Apologies, just bear with me everyone for a moment. I'm trying to just read this. This is just disappearing on me. But the workhouse history is never mentioned. But why was Portumna picked as a location for a workhouse given its small size? I would imagine though this is going back to kind of famine times, that we have to remember the population on the island was very dense.
Oh, well, what was wrong was the people in Portumna area and surrounding area that eventually came to Portumna Poor Law Union. They were going to workhouses in Lorrha and Ballinasloe,
Okay.
which were overflowing. So, you know, and that was happening in some of the bigger workhouses. So there was a need for smaller workhouses then in smaller towns like Portumna. And don't forget, when it opened in 1852, there was more than 300 people. You know, it was overcrowded by 300 people. So there was a necessity for it at that particular time. And again, because of the famine.
There aren't any other questions that I can see.
Okay.
But David, thank you very much. Certainly, I think everybody would, a lot of us will listen to the podcast, and I'll certainly send out that link.
Okay.
And hopefully, your talk tonight about Mr. Ogle will kind of maybe spur a little bit more interest into the other, maybe kind of the people that were behind in the background of these facilities.
Okay, I suppose I'll just finish on that. As I said, as you mentioned earlier on, I've studied public history in UL. And public history is just making history a little bit more accessible to kind of everybody. So, you know, reading history in an academic book mightn't be everybody's cup of tea. So, indeed, what we're doing here tonight is public history. You know, bringing it to people and making it more accessible to people across the seas, and making it a little bit more interesting to children as well, and the new generations that are coming behind us. That you know, history can be also learned in film form and podcasts and all sorts of different things. So so thank you very much for all your nice comments, and again, thanks for having me.
And David, just before you go, just before we finish, I want to mention that Fergus here mentioned that there's a contrasting story of a workhouse master is John Farrell, master of Sligo Workhouse, 1852 to 1866.
Yes.
And I suppose that again would be an interesting read for people.
I think that was printed by the Four Courts Press, or was it one of the Minute series? I think, and maybe it was one or the other. Anyway, it should be available online.
Okay. No, thank you very much, David.